Your phone and your camera are two very different things. So why do your photos look better on this than this? We're gonna be talking about that in this video today. Hey, what's up guys? My name's David Johnston. Welcome into the Landscape Photography University channel where we help you take photos that actually excite you. So if you're into that, subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell to come back every single time we have a video that's gonna help you improve your photography. Now, here's the thing about phone sensors. They have multiple sensors going on behind these two little dots on your lenses on the back of your phone camera. But here's the thing about them. They have tiny little sensors and computers inside of the phone. Now, if I open up my camera, you can see that the inside of the camera also has a sensor in it. This sensor is obviously much bigger because the camera is much bigger than your phone. So if you have a phone here, why is it looking so much better on the phone than on this much larger sensor? Well, let's jump into it. Let's look at the phone first. When you're thinking about your phone and the sensor size, the computing that goes on inside of your phone when you're taking a camera, there's a lot going on behind the scenes. Number one, most phones shoot only in JPEG format. JPEG is just an image file name that allows you to take a photo, and that photo is then computer generated into a file. So when you have a digital file in JPEG format, a lot of times your phone or even a camera, if you're shooting in JPEG, will add specific things to the photo. Your phone is very good at this, especially with the bright screens that you have on the phone that you're always looking at. Now, with the phone, what happens here is it's adding a lot of contrast and it's adding a lot of color saturation to the photo just going into it. It's also creating something called HDR imagery at times that helps your photo look better. Now, what are all these things and why do they make your phone photos look better than your camera? And that can be very frustrating. Well, number one, let's think about the contrast of a phone photo. The contrast of a phone photo separates the highlights and the shadows so that the highlights look brighter and the shadows look much darker. This can create a lot of texture. This can create a lot of what's called tone separation in a photo and make them look visually stronger than just a photo in your camera with none of that work being put into it. Color saturations are going to make your colors look much more vibrant and brighter and more intense than they would in just a regular image file, something like a raw image file, which we'll be getting into in just a little while. Now, lastly, the HDR stands for high dynamic range. A lot of scenes that you photograph, especially with a phone, maybe in midday, you're having a lot of very deep shadows, very dark shadows, and very bright highlights. That's a high dynamic range situation. When a phone or a camera sees a high dynamic range situation, it's difficult for them to balance out the shadows and the highlights together. The phone actually creates an HDR representation at times, if you have that setting on your phone, to create an image that shortens, for lack of a better term, the range in a high dynamic range photo so that you're left with a much more pleasing photo visually than you would be otherwise. This is brightening some of the shadows and darkening some of the highlights to try to balance out the light going on in your image. Now, before we get to your camera and why your camera isn't doing what your phone is doing and how you can fix that, I just want to ask you, do you have any problems with your own photography? Comment below so that I can see those, so that I can make videos for you and help you out with your own photography too. I'd love to help you with those problems. Just comment down below with those issues. Now, let's get to your camera. When you're looking at a camera sensor, especially when you take the lens off of your camera, you can see that it would obviously be much larger than your phone sensor. But it has a lot to do with the image file that you're photographing too. When you think about the image file, we talked about in the phone, it's shooting a JPEG file. If you're doing something like serious landscape photography or serious photography, you're typically shooting in RAW format. What RAW files are they are much larger files, which still makes no sense, and why your phone files, which are much smaller files, look better than what you're shooting on your camera. Well, that's because RAW files actually are made to be edited and made to be larger so that you can put edits into them on your computer, whether that be in something like Lightroom or Photoshop or some other editing software. Now, the reason that is because a lot of people are taking the photos from their camera and editing them on their computer, because the in-field work with an actual camera is 50% of the work, and the post-processing is another 50%. Post-processing, just another word for editing. So when you're looking at a camera and you're shooting in RAW format, how can you solve that? Because even if you go to a JPEG format, it's still probably not going to look as good as what you would do on your phone. It's because there are a lot of settings in your camera and your camera menu that you would have to do and perform on your own with your own knowledge of how to photograph an HDR, how to photograph something with a high dynamic range situation. Now, there are a couple editing things you can do with your photography when you get a photo in the field, especially with a RAW file, that I can show you how you can move a camera photo into the quality of a phone photo, because we spend all this money on a camera. Of course, we don't want it to turn into a paperweight that's collecting dust on our desk. So here's how to do that. Just a few quick clicks of the mouse. Now, let's take this photo for example. While it is a nice scene and there's a lot going on here, the photo is still pretty flat. It's nothing like the vibrant colors and the high dynamic range you can create with a phone photo. So how do you do that for your own photography taken with a camera? Now, if you go to the develop module in Lightroom or the editing portion in whatever editing software that you're using on your own, what you can do here is look at what's called the histogram. This shows you where the light is and where the brightness and darkness is in the photo. So you see a peak over here on the right. This would be your highlights and your whites portion of the histogram. And on the left, you have your shadows and your blacks. Now, because of this, I can see that I already have a lot of contrast in the photo. I can add more by pulling that out and increasing the contrast to about +18. Now for my highlights, I don't want to make them so bright that they're blown out, which means too white to have any data in those image files. So I'm just going to raise that just a little bit. Next, I'm going to darken my shadows slightly, and that brings that up to a point where you have a lot of that high dynamic range in there. Next, I'm going to go to image clarity and increase that some to allow for more detail and texture to be relevant in the photo too. Lastly, I'm going to come up here to my vibrance and saturation. If I pull my vibrance up and my saturation up, you can see that those colors, especially the greens in the background, really pop. So in just a couple clicks of the mouse, what I've been able to do is we look at the before and after. We've created a photo that doesn't look flat anymore and looks much more like we would get out of our phone, with a lot of that dynamic range, a lot of that color, and a lot of that interest coming into the photo. Now, if you want more information on how to use something like Lightroom or your camera settings, become a member of Landscape Photography University today. We have a free trial membership for a 7-day period that you can sign up for right now. I'll put that link in the video description below. Now, if you want more tips on how to take better photos and how to take photos that actually excite you, click on this playlist showing up right here.